Today's webinar is Carbon Offsetting and Insetting, Building Supply Chain Sustainability for Fashion Brands. The session aimed at fashion retailers and other businesses involved in the fashion sector. But of course, if you have a general interest in insetting, offsetting and life cycle analysis, or perhaps other topics that come up in the webinar, you'll no doubt find this session very interesting and relevant. As we go through the content, please do feel free to put questions in the chat bar. We aim to have around 10 to 15 minutes of Q&A at the end, so I will try to address your questions in the order they were asked. Once again, please mute. I can hear a little bit of feedback. So my name is Emily, and I lead carbon partnerships at Climate Connect Digital. My background is actually in advertising technology. I spent the last 5.5 years at Meta, formerly known as Facebook, before I transitioned into the climate space a couple of months ago, which I'm deeply passionate about. My role at Climate Connect Digital is to work with our valued partners in the carbon accounting and footprinting space to help enable their clients on the net zero journey. So that includes things like providing education and scaled learning sessions focused on the decarbonisation space, collaborating on events such as this webinar, for example, and exploring other ways to engage and enable clients as they navigate their carbon reduction journeys. So please don't hesitate to look me up on LinkedIn and drop me a line if you'd like to know more about how to partner with Climate Connect Digital. Before I introduce you to the speakers today, I actually just wanted to do a bit of scene setting. We all know by now that we are in a state of climate emergency. 2023 is the warmest year on record. July 2023 was the hottest month recorded on Earth since records began. Sea surface temperatures have hit unprecedented highs, exceeding hot tub temperatures in the Florida Keys. Heat waves and wildfires are ravaging communities, most recently in Canada. Heavy rainfall has led to devastation and destruction, in particular in India. Flooding, tropical storms and cyclones are impacting millions around the world. And as we speak, my phone is going off with pings from the news around the situation in Florida. We are already at around 1.2 degrees of warming. 1.5 degrees is the absolute limit that the Earth can withstand before even more disastrous effects start unfolding. This chart from the World Resources Institute shows world greenhouse gas emissions in 2019. So on the left there, you have the sector.
Emily, you're on mute.
Emily, you're on mute. Emily.
Sorry, have I been on mute the whole time?
No. Just a minute ago.
Oh, how strange. I don't know how that happened. So sorry, I don't know where I lost you. So I was just going through this chart from the World Resources Institute that shows world greenhouse gas emissions in 2019. So you have the sector there on the left, the use case in the middle, and the resulting gas emissions over on the right. Carbon dioxide emissions account for 75% of all greenhouse gases. So in total, greenhouse gas emissions are at around 50 billion tons per year. If we want to keep global warming in check, that means slowing down the devastating impacts of climate change that are already manifesting themselves. We have to reduce global emissions by 45% from 2010 levels, and we have to do that by 2030. And that will then put us on track for net zero by 2050. So where does the fashion industry come into this? McKinsey's Fashion on Climate report in 2020 highlighted that greenhouse gas emissions from the fashion industry amounted to 2.1 billion tons in 2018. So that's a pretty significant 4% of the total global greenhouse gas emissions. For context, that's actually the same amount of emissions as France, Germany, and the UK combined. But it's not always as straightforward to identify the root cause of all of these emissions. Broadly, they can be broken down into 3 areas. Manufacturers have to consider emissions across myriad areas such as energy usage, transport, sourcing of materials, production lines, and waste. Retailers have to consider their operations, their packaging, returns policies, as well as the footprint of their own employees. And then consumers need to think about washing their garments, recycling their clothing, whether to repair or discard items they no longer want or need, as well as their own personal emissions and other consumer choices that they have available to them. I'm sure you all agree it's a pretty complex space, but today Green Story and Climate Connect Digital are here to help you navigate your pathway through offsetting, insetting, and supply chains. Green Story, based in the Netherlands, specializes in life cycle analysis. The company is dedicated to the fashion, apparel, and footwear sectors, serving over 150 different clients across 15 countries, including some really notable names like ThreadUp and Zalando. Through its innovative technology platform, Green Story empowers brands to assess and convey the environmental footprint of their products. Green Story also facilitates carbon neutral purchases by enabling customers to support carbon offsetting projects. Climate Connect Digital works across the entire carbon value chain. We provide carbon advisory and net zero services, helping businesses to procure high quality carbon offsets at optimal prices and build a diversified portfolio of carbon projects across geographies, technologies, and vintages. We actually recently launched an innovative software platform called Carbon Shop, which enables our clients to search for, review, and purchase high quality offset projects. Partners can use our APIs to white label the solution and build the projects into their own platforms and then showcase them to their end clients. So Climate Connect Digital and Green Story are pleased to officially announce our joint partnership today. Through this partnership, clients in the fashion and apparel sector will be able to harness Green Story's industry expertise and life cycle analysis tools, as well as offset their emissions through Climate Connect Digital's high quality carbon projects and software solutions. So with that, I would like to introduce our first speaker today. Dr. Mustafa Khan is Head of Carbon and Climate Strategy at Climate Connect Digital. Dr. Mustafa has over 14 years of experience in climate project management and policy. He's worked on nature-based solutions, renewables, energy efficiency, and climate resilience. Dr. Mustafa has experience of working as part of the government, civil society organizations, and the private sector, and has a PhD with specialization in forest carbon. So with that, over to you, Dr. Mustafa.
Thank you. Thanks a lot, Emily, for that excellent grounding introduction and for all introducing me. So, as Emily was mentioning, it's critical that we achieve our 1.5 degrees Celsius targets. Otherwise, the impact that we're having on Earth will be much more than what we're seeing now. And the economists and scientists think that these impacts will be so much that it will be hard to adapt to them, especially for our socio-economic systems to adapt to these. So the Earth would survive. It's our question, whether we would be there or not. So how do you mitigate? If you want to stop climate change from happening, what we need to do is to do mitigation. You can do mitigation by two ways. One is by offsetting, the other by the insetting. So offsetting happens when you are acting outside your value chain to reduce your carbon emissions. That's known as offsetting. So for example, you're a plane manufacturer and you're getting a lot of inputs. For example, you need equipment which moves heavy material around, right? And you are emitting emissions while you're making the planes or parts for the planes. However, you're going and investing or buying credits from a forestry project. So this is offsetting. It doesn't happen within your value chain. It doesn't happen within the component manufacturer. It's not happening within your system. It's not that it's happening on the plane operator's side, right? So this is outside your value chain. This is known as offsetting, and you're investing in a forestry project. The other example is for insetting in the below in the panel. So this example clearly shows that, so what you're doing is you're in a food manufacturing industry, you're in a food processing industry. So you're procuring raw material from the farms, you're processing it, and then you're delivering the things into the market. So over here, you are getting things on the land. So in the same agricultural lands, if you say that, okay, let me invest money and plant some trees. So while the trees grow, they absorb the carbon, and therefore you're doing insetting. So this activity is same. However, all that's different is the context and your value chain and from where you're deriving your value chain from. So if these things are happening within your value chain, this is known as insetting. Next slide. So while we all understand, offsetting a little bit better, but a lot of confusion still exists on insetting. So here is some explanation, on what all insetting consists of. So if you're offsetting within your own supply chain is one kind of example. So instead of, going outside your value chain, instead if you invest within your value chain, and you reduce the emissions for carbon and greenhouse gas emissions, that's insetting. Similarly, you can also explain it in terms of using carbon finance to abate emissions within your value chain. So you are using money to buy credits, that's outside, that's known as offsetting. While if you use the money to reduce the emissions within your value chain, that again becomes insetting. So these GHG emission reductions and carbon storage can take place. That's how you can design the interventions, or you can also design interventions to create much beyond just the carbon part of it. This could be social angle, this could be the biodiversity angle for your projects. So insetting could take a number of shapes and forms depending on your context and your supply chains. Next. However, offsetting, we hear a lot of concerns about carbon credits, offsetting in the media, as some of you might have noticed, but similar concerns are also there around insetting. And surprisingly, the concerns are also very similar. So first, for example, is a concern around avoiding double counting. So how do we avoid double counting when we are doing insetting? So for example, you are doing insetting, you are reducing your own emissions. For example, in your office, to take a very simplistic example, in your office, you have changed your light bulbs to LEDs, and now you're using less amount of energy, and therefore the carbon emissions are reduced. Now, if you take the same project and get it registered onto one of the registries, one of the carbon registries, and then claim carbon credits on it, sell those carbon credits in the market, while on the other hand, you also report to the carbon disclosure project or to the SBTI against your internal emission reduction targets. So you shouldn't do both of them. You can do either one of them. And if you do both of them, then it's known as double counting. So one needs to avoid that. And that's a major concern in insetting right now, because it's much less regulated as compared to offsets. The second is that of additionality. The question is to prove additionality, whether you would have done the thing in the absence of your net zero targets or your internal carbon prices. So if you had no net zero targets, or if you had no neutrality targets, would you have gone ahead and put your money over there? So it's kind of a question of, did you take pains to achieve this, or would you have done it anyway for economic reasons, for reducing your electricity bills, your energy bills, your fuel costs, those sort of things. Next. So in order to guarantee this, in order to maintain a check on this, in order to provide assurance that these two things are not happening besides other things, that double counting is not taking place, and that additionality criteria is being adhered to, the various standards, they have now come up with these guidelines, standard setting documents, which clearly outline how they are going to manage this. For example, VCS 4.4, which came out in December last year, it clearly mentions that in case you're generating carbon credits upstream, all your downstream channel partners need to display that some of the products used in what you're buying might have generated carbon credits in the upstream. So that needs to be mentioned, so that there is no double counting and avoidance of double counting takes place. Similarly, gold standard, so they have brought out a whole guidance on value chain interventions, and if a company is acting within its value chain, what are the various things that it needs to consider. So this is coming out from the gold standard. Gold standard and Vera are both very well-known carbon offset registries. So in a sense, you get an idea of on how from offsetting to insetting, there needs to be standards which need to be followed for questions not to be raised on your actions. Next. So these are the challenges and the trends that we see in the offsetting and insetting markets, right? So ensuring emission reduction legitimacy. Many times we see that people have not reduced emissions and yet they claim it. So this is a challenge for both offsetting and insetting. Similarly, navigating the verification complexities. There's so many standards. So so you need to be sure, to which standard are you adhering to, and are the processes being done in the right manner? Are you measuring the right thing? Are the right things being reported? The right conversion factors being used? So all those verified, they need to be verified. Similarly, you need to make nuanced decisions. This is especially true in terms of insetting, but also for offsetting. You need to know which project to invest in, which intervention to invest in within your value chains. Does it make a meaningful difference to your emission reductions and those kind of things? And then obviously you need to adopt a long-term strategy. That's a big challenge. What happens is that many companies have an year-to-year target of emission reductions or offsetting, and they adhere to it. But it also helps if you have a long-term challenge, and if you're doing your annual actions or semi-annual actions as part of a long-term strategy. So that's a challenge sometimes, and therefore a trend that we are seeing, is a trend towards shift towards insetting. So earlier, there used to be a lot of focus on offsets. Now we are saying that there's a much more balanced approach between offsetting and insetting. So it indicates an industry that's maturing. A preference for nature-based offset projects. Why? Because they also contribute to society and biodiversity. Increased verification emphasis with third-party involvement, etc. That's also something that we have been noticing to assure quality of the emission reductions, and then a focus on sustainable innovation in terms of product manufacturing to reduce the emissions in-house. And that's an emphasis which is taking place much more on the research and development as well as on the implementation side. Next. Next slide. Okay, so the major voluntary target setting instrument is the SBTI. If you can go to the previous slide, please. Is the SBTI or the science based? Yeah, I think this is the right slide now. Yeah, correct. So this is the science based target initiative. So this is a voluntary scheme. What companies are promoted to do over here is to come on and take targets to become net zero. Generally, companies take targets to become net zero by 2050, and all these targets are in line with the Paris Agreement's overall goal of limiting climate change or warming or global warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius. So for each sector, they divide the targets for carbon emissions, and then under each sector, wherever your company is located in, you are given a target based on that. So you have to bring down your emissions, for example, by 50% down to 2035, and for example, by 2050 to or to become 100% or 95% by 2050. 100% is not possible for obvious reasons. There are some emissions which always take place. I will see in the next slide. Yes, so over here, as I was mentioning, right? So you set a target in year one. That's the long graph on, that's the long bar on the left-hand side. And then you say that by 2050, I'll become net zero. So while you're on your journey in year one to year two, maybe you'll reduce your emissions by in-house measures by 10%. You're still emitting a lot of emissions. So you are taking actions, progressive actions each year to bring down your net emissions. However, each year you're still emitting some of the greenhouse gas emissions are taking place. Carbon is being emitted. So you need to take care of both. You reduce your emissions, and whatever you are emitting needs to be offset by using carbon credits. So SBTI recognizes the role of both in-house measures to reduce emissions within the value chain, and also outside the value chain where you can't reduce, you have to buy these credits from the offset markets, the voluntary market. So that's clearly recognized. Even when you become carbon neutral by 2050, you will have some residual emissions, right? Any industry, any office, any institution can't become absolutely zero in terms of carbon emissions. There will be some amount of carbon emissions which will take place. So you need to take care of that even while you are achieving carbon neutrality or becoming net zero. So becoming net zero doesn't mean that you don't need to use offsets. Of course, you can use offsets, but this needs to be in combination with in-house measures. That's the critical part. Next. So this is the reaction. I mean, we have seen a lot of news flow around carbon offsets and various things. So the Voluntary Carbon Market Integrity Initiative has now come out with its claims code that companies which are claiming to become net zero or carbon neutral, we see these various tags, etc. How can they do that? So what they have said that the VCMI has laid out 4 criteria. These are the foundational criteria which your company needs to do. One, you need to maintain a publicly you need to maintain a publicly disclosed record of your GHG emissions on an annual basis. Secondly, you need to set up and disclose publicly your targets, the science-based targets. That's the second one. Third one, you need to demonstrate progressive action. You need to show how that you're on track to achieve your net zero targets while you're progressing on year basis, right? And then you also need to showcase how you are demonstrating your alignment with the Paris goals, not just on emission reductions, but also beyond it. For example, in your contribution towards society, or for example, technology transfer to developing countries, capacity building, those kind of things, beyond just the carbon part of it. It could also be in terms of biodiversity. Next slide. So once you have done these foundational criteria, on top of it, on top of the foundational criteria, now you can make your claims. So on top of the foundational criteria, if you are offsetting 20% to 60% of your emissions, residual emissions for a given year, then you can have a silver claim. If you are offsetting 60% to 100% of your emissions, then you can have a gold claim. Similarly, if you're doing 100%, 100% of your emissions are being offset by carbon credits, then you can have a platinum claim. So this is the VCMI's labeling system right now. Remember, all these have to be achieved over and beyond internal emission reduction measures, right? It doesn't mean that you stop doing actions which will reduce your emissions in the first place. You do all that. Beyond that, what's happening in terms of emissions need to be offset and can be offset, and these labels can then be used. Next slide. So now coming to the fashion sector, since most of us are from that sector, and today we are over here to discuss this sector in the 1 hour that we have. So let's focus on that. So what we have is that by 2018, the emissions from the fashion industry was about 2.1 billion tons of GHG. And then, what we see is that if no actions are taken, these emissions will go to 2.7 billion tons. And if the current pace of decarbonization goes on, we will reach 2.1 billion tons by 2030. Whereas if we want to limit our impact on global warming to 1.5, we need to cut it down to 1.1. So we are on 2.1 and we are going to hit 1.1. That's our target. So we have to, 50% emission reductions just from the fashion industry is required if we are to meet these 1.5 degrees Celsius targets by 2030. So in terms of this, therefore, a lot of fashion industry people have taken actions. In the following slides, we will see a few examples of what the companies have done in both in terms of insetting and offsetting. Next. So this is the next slide, shows you the example of Burberry and how they are doing this and how they're reducing their emissions, etc. Number one, what they're trying to do is that, they have done work on the energy efficiency in buildings. So that's one way of doing it. So secondly, they're also promoting a lot of sustainable cotton, cultivation, harvesting practices, etc. So that the emission factors or the emission that's linked to the cotton growing and harvesting becomes less. Similarly, they're also promoting reuse of, recycling of the packaging material, especially when it comes to like 40% of their up to 40% of the material, of the packaging material that they use is being sourced from the recycled material. So these are the various ways how these companies, in-house or outside, are trying to reduce their emissions. Next. So the next one is from Ghani. Over here, they are partnering with their suppliers to install solar panels through which they are reducing emissions up to the tune of 8.3 metric tons of CO2 equivalent annually. They're also trying to implement measures which improve biodiversity in the land areas surrounding their factories. Next. These are like footwear companies, Aldo and On. So Aldo is using clean energy projects in India and China to reduce their footprint and sustainability goals. And then also forest conservation in Amazon. While On is very famous, famously has developed a foaming material which absorbs CO2 and therefore directly sequesters carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere. Next. The next examples are from Sheep Inc., and they are going beyond carbon neutrality, as their headline statement says. So they are also entering into creating biodegradable products, allocating 5% of their revenues to biodiversity projects with climate experts involved. Similarly, Marks and Spencer's is purchasing 2 million tons of carbon offsets, during these various years. They're also very famously gone into the cooking stoves or energy efficient cooking stoves, which also has a lot of social benefits, primarily towards women. So they are doing these investments to reduce their emissions through cooking stoves and within their value system itself. Similarly, they have also been investing in the Climate Innovation Fund, as we have already mentioned. So a lot of this emission reductions, in-house emission reduction especially, is being driven by innovation and trying to figure out how they can reduce their emissions within their value chains by using innovation methods or even input material which goes into the fashion industry. Next slide. So as we see in the previous slides, so various companies in the fashion industry are using a mix of insetting and offsetting options. So obviously the question becomes that while you are doing insetting and you're trying to reduce your emissions, when you go for offsetting, what is the kind of projects that you choose? So that's a large question which was posed to the voluntary market. How do you choose the appropriate projects and the appropriate carbon credits? So in order to fill this void, so ICVCM, the Integrity Council for Voluntary Carbon Market, they have in July end have come out with the core carbon principles. These core carbon principles help us identify the good quality projects. So what they have said is that 3 sets of practices that have been core carbon principles that have been highlighted, total 10. So they're into 3 sets. The one is on the emissions impact. That's where we should most concerned be. The second is more to do with the governance. This is at the standard, as for example, Vera or for example, gold standard. These are the various standards that you're using. So how are they being governed? The governance for the standard itself, and then thirdly on sustainable development. So if you see one by one on the emissions impact, is the carbon project additional? Would this project have happened if you are not putting in money and buying these carbon credits? So if not, then the project is not additional. If the project would not have been possible without you buying the carbon credits, of course, then it's an additional project and it's money worth spending. Second is permanence. So a lot of credits, in fact, a lot of good quality credits also sometimes suffer from the point of permanence. So for example, if there is a tree growing, but what happens if this tree gets destroyed for natural or unnatural reasons? So that there's a permanence risk over there. So those kind of questions have been raised over there. And robust quantification of emissions. So it should not be that you are reducing by 10 and you're claiming 12 or 15 credits, right? So if you're reducing 10, then the claim should also be for 10 tons and not more than that. No double counting, as we have seen earlier. So in governance, this comes to effective governance, being transparent about the things and ensuring that the third party verifiers and validators who ensure that the quality of the carbon credits is really high are trained properly, are selected properly, and that they're doing their jobs correctly. So that's in the governance part. And then in the sustainable development part, we have touched upon it briefly, but I can revisit that. For example, if you're investing into a project for reducing carbon, does it have any SDGs attached to it? The sustainable development goals. How many SDGs does your project where you're trying to buy these carbon credits from achieve? Generally, the more the number of SDGs, the better it's supposed to be. These SDGs could be in terms of ending poverty, ending hunger, and various other things. And then the second point is very critical over here. It should be contributing to the net zero transition. You should not be buying credits from a project, which in the long run will increase carbon emissions. For example, if the carbon credits are coming from a coal project, so that's what the ICVCM core carbon principles try to check on. Next slide. So the ICVCM, as I was mentioning, has just been launched in July end. It hasn't been implemented as in applied to the various standards and projects, etc. So we'll have to wait maybe 1 or 2 years before the application comes through, and we'll get projects, which are like under the ICVCM label of the CCP label. So in the meantime, how do you do that? So the International Carbon Reduction and Offsetting Accreditation Code of Best Practices is already in place for quite a few years. So they also have their own criteria by which they check, or in short, it's called ICROA. So ICROA also checks various standards, so if they are real, measurable, permanent, their project activities are additional, if they're independently verified by auditors, and if they're unique. So that's avoiding double counting. So these are the criteria. Next slide. And these are the standards, which the ICROA has already endorsed for the following 6 criteria that we saw earlier. So in the meantime, while the ICVCM CCPs are coming up, and that would be really great whenever they're there. In the meanwhile, you can use the ICROA standards as some sort of an assurance that some of these basic checks, the sanity checks, have been done for the projects that you're investing. With that, I'll thank you all, and I'll be happy to take questions. And back to you, Emily.
Thank you so much, Dr. Mustafa. That was incredibly interesting and lots to digest. I can see we have some questions in the Q&A section already, so keep them coming and we will address everything at the end. I've seen some people have popped questions in the chat function as well, so I will follow up with those, but preferably if you could pop them into the Q&A section, that would be ideal. So next up is Dr. Kannan Muthu, who is Chief Sustainability Officer at Green Story. Dr. Muthu is a globally recognized expert in life cycle assessment in textiles and clothing. And then with around 20 years of experience, he offers unparalleled insights into sustainability, environmental and chemical management, sustainable materials, and the circular economy in the textiles and clothing supply chain. Dr. Muthu has a PhD in environmental life cycle assessment in textiles and clothing. So, Dr. Muthu, I will hand over to you. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Emily. Hello, everyone. good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are. So, after hearing from Dr. Mustafa at length in terms of various concepts, various thoughts around insetting and offsetting, now I'm going to, talk about how, when you start doing a supply chain assessment, how your supply chain analysis is going to inform what strategy you have to follow. So just to begin with, I'm going to introduce few terminologies. I'm sure these are all well-known terminologies, but just to recall them. So first one is supply chain analysis or assessment. So that means you are assessing your supply chain. You understand that you can assess your supply chain by means of evaluating any footprint for that matter, water footprint, carbon footprint, ecological footprint, or anything. So here, since we talk about carbon footprint, so let's talk about in relation to carbon footprint. So supply chain analysis here, it's a means of evaluating each of the activities involved in a company's value chain to understand very clearly, very importantly, I would say, where the opportunities for the improvement lies. For example, in this case, carbon footprint. As I told you, if you're looking for carbon footprint, so supply chain assessment will get you the areas where you need to focus upon to alleviate the footprints in terms of greenhouse gas emissions. The tool, one of the tools which is used to do, there are a lot of tools, right? So one of the tools is life cycle assessment. It is used to calculate, in this case, the carbon footprint for a supply chain assigned to a product to validate the environmental footprint. Again, this is carbon footprint or water footprint or any footprint for that matter. So what is very important is, based on the assessment, the hotspots are identified as intervention points for maximum carbon reduction opportunities. Right? So these are the two basic terminologies we have to recall first. Then, next slide, please. Let's talk about carbon reduction strategies. So, what is the current strategies and what are the gaps? So first, where is carbon predominantly being emitted when you look at the textile and fashion supply chain? So the World Resources Institute, WRI, states that a fashion brand's carbon footprint is mainly attributed to its manufacturing supply chain. Again, accounting for 96% of any brand's total emissions, emissions in total. That means, what does it mean? This means that the responsibility lies with the factories, of course, and farmers who produce the fibers such as cotton, wool, and say leather, for any raw material for that matter, to make the necessary changes for brands to achieve their ambitious goals as publicized in their SBTs, which we have heard from Dr. Mustafa before. So now the question is, how suppliers and factories get there on time for companies to reach their goals? And $1 million question is, will they within the time span which has to be followed? Next. So carbon reduction strategies in the fashion supply chain. Fashion companies are adapting offsetting practices, but again, offsetting practices focused on carbon reduction projects, which include committing to SBTIs to reduce the carbon emissions within the supply chain, what we have talked about, and then increase the use of, let's say, few aspects such as sustainable transport means, sustainable packaging options. Maybe you can think of decarbonizing your retail operations. Of course, switching to recycled materials versus virgin materials. So these are some of the practices focused on carbon reduction aspects within the fashion industry. Next one. But what I wanted to tell you is that focus on a convenient strategy rather than a holistic strategy. If you look at a promising way to reduce their emissions. Now, having heard about strategies what have to be in place, now I want to tell you what are the typical gaps in fashion industry when it comes to carbon reduction strategies. Fashion companies, almost they're not in touch with the raw material suppliers. Overall, I'm saying, of course, there could be some exceptions. Again, exceptions cannot be generalized. I hope you all will agree with me. So although they mostly emit about, which we learned from one of the previous slides from WRI, the statistics says that 96% of the 96% of the product's carbon over its life cycle. So there is a wide gap where target setting is taking place at fashion companies and emissions are mostly emitted at tier 4. So that's a quite gap, and target setting on carbon reduction strategies are taking place in different areas in the supply chain. So some carbon reduction projects are not addressing the predominantly important hotspots within the supply chain. So that's what currently happening within the fashion supply chain. Next one, please. So when we talk about insetting, the fashion industry is, I would say, very recently started moving towards insetting carbon as a reduction strategy. This strategy targets hotspots throughout the entire supply chain. So you might ask, how can I find my hotspots within the supply chain? So as I told you, LCA is the way. Once you undertake a LCA study for a typical product within your area of your supply chain, then your LCA consultant, you can come to us like Green Story. We'll be happy to do undertake a LCA study for you within your supply chain, and we'll take the lens to find out where are the major hotspots lie, which you can work with to reduce the majority of your footprints. So what I want to conclude within this slide is minimize the environmental impact where it really happens and not elsewhere, right? Identifying where it happens is a result which you can aim to get it from a LCA study, right? Next one. So let's talk about carbon reduction strategies. Before we get there, just I want to go through few terminologies again. So one is we heard about carbon offsetting and different terminologies we heard from Dr. Mustafa, but just to get a recap very quickly. Carbon offsetting, so reduction in carbon emissions or increase in carbon storage. For example, planting of trees used to compensate for emissions that occur elsewhere. So what is credit? Carbon offset credit. It's a transferable instrument certified by governments or any independent certification bodies to represent an emission reduction of 1 metric ton of carbon or carbon equivalent. So what is insetting? Carbon insetting. It's an alternative approach to offsetting that localizes nature-based solutions projects and other GHG removal activities within companies' value chains. Again, as we have been hearing, adopted by major global brands. So these are few terminologies. Just just let's get a recap of this. So followed by which we'll go to the next slide. So what I want to tell you is that in the it again, I'm not saying just by one or two cases. Being in the space for almost 2 decades and having spoken to a lot of brands and a lot of partners who are really very passionate in terms of reducing emissions. And with that, I'm saying going beyond a solo approach to carbon offsetting is the need of the hour for the entire fashion sector. So again, the effectiveness of the offsets is sometimes, just generally we hear that, they're not that accurate. Sometimes it could be misleading. So again, we were told that offsets do divert from the long-term actual reduction of carbon emissions by polluters. So according to the research, the net result of emitting plus offsetting is never equivalent to that of not emitting. So that comes from a reference, Barras 2022. Therefore, what I want to conclude is that the fashion industry absolutely in dire need of a new carbon reduction strategy or strategies rather that are beyond carbon offsetting and absolutely look for addressing the manufacturing processes within the supply chain. Right. Next slide, please. So my ideology or my thoughts are over adopting a collaborative approach to insetting is absolutely required, and again it is a need of the hour. So the purpose of offsetting is to benefit an external source to reduce the carbon emissions. So the purpose of insetting is empower own organizations' efforts to reduce the carbon emissions. So building supply chain resilience within the value chain by building partnerships within their suppliers. I'm sure you're all coming from fashion industry, so you know this. Just to give you an example, most of the cases, right? Some of the job orders, typically factories within the supply chains, they need to give it. For example, you are knitting a fabric or you are weaving a fabric, and then you are doing all the chemical process. Sometimes for a knitted fabric, you would give, let's say, standard operations to outside, or might be most of the cases, you will get it done, your printing done from an external, let's say, through a job order partner of your supply chain. So what I'm saying is working within the entire supply chain partners through a partnership, through a meaningful partnership. This is absolutely required. And this is what the insetting is going to do for this entire supply chain. And this is absolutely required. So the purpose of offsetting is to benefit an external source to reduce carbon, where, as I said before, but I just want to reiterate, insetting brings empowerment within the own organization to reduce carbon emissions. And very importantly, it helps to build supply chain resilience within the entire value chain. So, this will strengthen the relationships by partnering within the entire supply chain partners. Right. So what I want to, say as a conclusive remark for this at this point is, this collaborative approach will strengthen the supply chain for sustainable development, where multi-stakeholders come forward, they share knowledge, expertise, technology, financial resources to support the reducing environmental footprints or carbon emissions. So that's absolutely required to make the entire supply chain of fashion and textiles, moving towards sustainable. Next. So where can I look up in terms of carbon reduction strategies? So we already talked about what is LCA. So again, LCA can be done in different variants: credit to gate, credit to gate, credit to grave. Gate means, as you know, raw material manufacturing, then just top till transportation, and just from fact, credit to manufacturing gate. But if I just span the entire life cycle phases, including use and disposal, and see what happens at the end of life, and then just, study the environmental impacts across the entire life cycle span, that's called cradle to grave. Of course, you can also extend it to cradle to cradle. There are many variants of doing LCA study. So the, LCA is a comprehensive analytical tool that enables a thorough examination of a product's environmental footprint through its entire life cycle phases. And LCA consultants like Green Story, for example, we would help you to quantify the carbon emissions, and we will help you to bring out strategically, we'll help you to bring out identification points in a strategical way for intervention to reduce the carbon footprint within the supply chain. The assessment covers all stages from raw material extraction till disposal, as I told you, from cradle to gate or grave or to cradle, highlighting emission intensive phases you have to work with. And benefits of an LCA is not only for carbon emissions, I have to reiterate, but it provides a more holistic approach to environmental impacts and accounts for various impact categories, for example, biodiversity. So the results of an LCA study can be used to quantify the CO2 emissions per product, which are going to be used for carbon offsetting options, and identify intervention points for carbon inset potentials throughout the supply chains. Next one, please. So now let's talk about carbon insetting and offsetting strategies. So at this point, I'm sure you had a clear idea of what insetting is going to bring to me, what offsetting is going to bring to me. And we also talked about complementary approaches, right? And again, just going beyond the solo approach. So now let's talk about insetting versus offsetting. And again, this is a very lengthy topic, but I just want to confine my discussions in terms of 6 parameters. One is the approach. Insetting brings a collaborative approach. Offsetting brings unilateral. And in terms of, so what is the scope, right? In terms of emission reductions, insetting is confined to scope 3, offsetting the entire scope 1 to 3. And the parties involved in carbon reduction in terms of insetting, it put onus on the brand to reduce the supply chain emissions, rather than making up for them elsewhere. But in case of offsetting, it reduces emissions for an external third party. In terms of standards, for insetting, it doesn't require verification against globally agreed standards. On the other hand, offsetting requires verification against globally agreed standards. And you also heard from Dr. Mustafa on all these aspects. And when I talk about the very, very important aspect, which is cost-related benefits, in case of insetting, reduce costs and increase legitimacy, which act as competitive advantages for the company, and it absolutely enhances, boosts the reputation. On the other hand, offsetting, like it brings additional financial costs on the company. We talked about approach before, and credit issuance. In terms of insetting, it helps to generate credits to be claimed against its climate targets, where in case of offsetting, generating credits to be claimed against its climate targets. Right. So this is what a comparative assertion between insetting and offsetting with these material topics, which we talked about, 6 topics. Next. So, I want to, put forward carbon offsetting as a complementary approach to insetting. So for that, if you just perceive carbon offsetting alone, so I would term this as a reactive approach. Carbon insetting, I would claim this as a proactive approach. So as I told you, what is very much essential, rather, which is, I would say, not emergent, rather emergent for the entire fashion supply chain, is carbon insetting and offsetting, which is a value seeker. So this helps cut down own emissions, enhancing or boosting the efficiency of the supply chain, and very importantly, address both direct and indirect emissions by participating in carbon offsetting projects. So that is what, in terms of complementary approach, where carbon offsetting complements insetting. So offsetting complemented by insetting, or insetting plus offsetting, will bring enormous benefits to the supply chain of fashion and textiles. Next, please. So what are the radical approaches in terms of insetting carbon emissions? So there are, few principles or few processes. One is, let's begin with the mapping the entire supply chain, right? So when you look at brands, typical brands have, their own distinction or, definition of tiers, as well as in terms of their own supply chains, right? So mapping the entire supply chain from raw material to use phase. And one more thing, what I want to tell you is that, okay, again, this is quite happening in fashion and textile supply chain, is that, okay, just you want to replicate someone else's, carbon reduction strategies. That's not going to be possible. I have seen a lot of cases where, there are abrupt failures because of that. So what I want to tell you is that try to map the entire supply chain of yours from raw material till the disposal or use phase. Then once you map it, go for measuring. So I just mentioned to you before, just go with LCA, which is one of the most promising and one of the most successful tools, which is used to measure and communicate the impact savings of a carbon offset project. So you have mapped and measured. What next? The third one is materialize. So here comes the interventions, such as some manufacturing happens within one place. For example, fiber, chemical processing, garmenting versus, moving between different places. The entire supply chain is quite intermittent. Sometimes it could be vertically integrated, sometimes it is not. So we need to really find out that one. Second one, replacing fossil fuel feedstock with biomass, maybe installing a carbon capture and storage system. Then collaborate with raw material farmers to implement, for example, regenerative practices. So, I'm just giving some, rather few examples of interventions, such as what we discuss about now. Then the fourth one is, after you, just, work out the intervention points. So then you have clear strategy of what's happening. Then this is like a PDCA cycle, right? Plan, do, check, and act. Of course, there is no hard and fast rule. Sometimes, you have to really see, what really works, what really needs some more fine tuning to get to the targets. Now, I just want to wrap up my talk with few recommendations. So recommendations, again, based on best practice and expertise. So when you plan to launch insetting projects, right, start to strategize with long-term suppliers who share your company's commitment to responsibly has proven beneficial. Second one, once a project partnership has been finalized with the first supplier, involve devising a future strategy based on these insights to extend the approach to more suppliers. Maybe you cannot roll out the entirety within the supply chain just overnight. It's not going to be possible. It's not going to fetch any fruitful results. So you have to just go with a multi-tiered approach. And it's also equally important to measure beyond carbon emissions, adopting a holistic approach that considers, again, biodiversity and local climate change factors. Next slide, please. Then, investing in emerging technologies of potential to combine the advantages of both methods like insetting and offsetting, at the same time maintaining the positive reputation linked with insetting while retaining the adaptability of offsetting. So these are a few recommendations, again, which are all based on best practice and expertise. So this will help you to achieve your strategies or your ambitions in terms of reducing the carbon emissions which you have targeted within the supply chain. With that, let me conclude my talk and pass it back to Emily. Emily, over to you.
Thank you so much. That was some really detailed and very practical content. So we've had a lot of insights, gone really deep into understanding the differences between offsetting and insetting and how to balance the processes out. We've had a lot of deep dives into terminology, so hopefully you've all learned a lot. We have around 6 minutes left, and I can see a few questions in the chat. Of course, feel free to keep putting your questions in the chat, but I am going to start with the first one from Supreet, which came in quite early on. So I assume this question is in relation to Carbon Shop, which is our platform. So the question is, who curates or lists the projects on the mentioned platform, which is Carbon Shop? So Dr. Mustafa, are you able to take that question?
Yeah, sure. So yeah, thanks for that question. So on Carbon Shop, of course, we have our projects mentioned over there. We do it ourselves. So we go through these projects. We look into the various documents. For example, you have the project design document to begin with. Following this, there is a monitoring report which is usually produced on an annual basis. Each time the project goes, for issuance of credits, they have to do this monitoring report. There's a verification report also by a third-party auditor. So we go through these reports. We also see if there are any adverse remarks over there, or whether the SDGs that were mentioned in the project design document have they been adhered to in the verification report as well. So these are some of the things that that we do. We also bring out some of these projects, especially the in-focus projects. We can also bring out some 2-pagers, right, which go into deep dive into these projects and showcase the positives and the negatives for each one of them. Emily, feel free to add.
No, I think that's super detailed. Thank you. But of course, definitely visit the Climate Connect Digital website. We'll share a link afterwards, and you can sign up to have a demo of the platform or to hear more about the platform. We'd be happy to take you through it. The next question that we have in the last 4 minutes that we have to go is, who sets the targets for bringing down the emissions? Is it voluntary or set by external parties? How is an informed number proposed and promised? So that's a sort of a 3-part question. Dr. Muthu, would you be available to take that one? So perhaps we can break it down. So who sets the targets for bringing down the emissions?
Right. Okay. Let me take this answer. Of course, Dr. Mustafa, you are most welcome to add and complement anything to what I'm going to say. Right. So that's a great question, actually. So this is, again, it is not only for carbon, it's also for various other parameters. For example, energy too. So like as I told you, when we look at, let's say, coming from a proper and a pragmatic approach in terms of assessing the supply chain, right? Let me take with an example. So, for example, now I'm analyzing a cotton shirts supply chain, right? So I just use LCA to analyze. Okay, I just take a example of a cotton shirt, and you can see that okay, it's starting from fiber manufacturing from cotton from fields, then go to ginning, then spinning, then it's a woven shirt, so it goes to weaving again, starting from binding, warping, sizing and weaving, then gets into the complete chemical manufacturing link. So where it is starting from desicing to bleaching, covering, severing, and then get again with dyeing, finishing, then you get it printed if required, then like all the chemical process are done, then you get into the, let's say, garment manufacturing link. So then it's packed. So let's assume that it's cradle to gate. So here I've just assessed, and now I just come out with, okay, this is the total carbon footprint of a woven cotton shirt, which is the product under question. For example, it comes out to be 4 kg CO2e per product, for example, right? Which weighs 500 grams, for example. So then here we look at with the lens of, okay, where are the biggest opportunities lie for me to reduce the emissions, right? So now here it comes, okay, so there are, let's say, I identify 5 big major hotspots. For example, first one is, let's say, in terms of carbon, the dyeing comes out as the first one. Second one is weaving. Third one is, okay, the maybe a spinning process, for example. So I just likewise I identified 5 major hotspots. Now, within each process, right, there could be short-term, medium-term, and long-term parameters to work with. So as a consultant, who has experience on ground, so there are few aspects any factory or any supplier can do it immediately without having gigantic investments in place. So we will try to accommodate, maybe we'll try to enlist, okay, these are the different approaches where you can really think of doing it with short term, and this is the cost going to be, medium term, and this is what the cost is going to be, and long term, which is again a very promising way, and this is what the cost is going to be. So when we have, okay, what is lacking today is this kind of thoroughness and this kind of clarity when it comes to the assessment, as well as bringing out the the alleviation or the reduction strategy. So once it comes, most of the cases, the suppliers would be able to check with us. Okay, Dr. Muthu, what do you think of this? Can we do this? So, sometimes there could be no apprehension at all. Sometimes there could be some reservations. Suppliers will say, no, this seems to be, really not feasible. So what I want to tell you is that the reduction strategies, it is not going to be set just only by one person. It has to be, again, a collaborative approach. So when I come to one table, okay, this is what we have assessed, and this is what the reduction strategy is going to be, and what do you think? And when they come, okay, this is what we can do, and this way we can collaboratively find out what is the possible reduction strategy, and what is the time frame in place, what is the cost, and what can be done. And once this is all done, we don't stop. It is not the stopping point. It's actually the beginning. Then we will have to reassess, okay, this is what we targeted, where we are, and how much we need to go further. So that's how it should be. Did I answer this question? Sorry, I gave a much more lengthy answer.
That's perfectly fine. That was super detailed. So thank you very much. We are actually at time. I don't know if we can go 1 minute over. We have maybe we can shortly answer this question. Is the criteria for SBTI robust enough to be successful? Daniel says he's been reading, and if he understands correctly, the targets criteria allows for a reduction of product intensity, but that doesn't equate to absolute emissions reductions. I don't know whether there's a sort of 30-second answer to that one, but you can also follow up on my email afterwards, Daniel. I've dropped my email address in the Q&A box there. But do we have a quick response to that at all?
Yeah, let me respond to that. So of course, there are various kinds of targets under SBTI that you can take, and the SBTI says that that you need to become net zero. This is slightly also answering the previous question, also that you need to become net zero by 2050. However, that's the latest. You can voluntarily agree to become net zero much before that. You can set up a target of 2040, 2035 to become net zero. So that's partially also answering on who decides. On what kind of targets that you want to take, whether you want to take a per unit economic output target, whether you want to take a per unit quantity target of CO2 emission reductions, or you want an absolute target. Those things are also to a certain extent flexible. And if you want to take a hard set target, that's really commendable. Some people have done that, but that really needs some level of execution and planning.
Thank you. Okay, well, thank you so much, everyone. We are slightly over time, but we had so much fantastic, interesting content. As I mentioned at the start, we will be sharing the slides and the recording within the next 24 hours, I believe. So really appreciate you joining and taking time out for your busy days. You can, of course, follow up with us on our various websites. So Green Story is www.greenstory.io. And Climate Connect Digital is www.climateconnect.digital. So let's take a wrap there. Thank you so much to our speakers and everyone involved in organising this very first joint partnership webinar. We hope for many more, and enjoy the rest of your days and weeks. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.